Thanks for joining us for today's Green at Google Talk. My name is Alice Mount, and I work on data center environmental health and safety. It's with great pleasure and excitement that I introduce our three speakers. Although each has a very different background, they are here today with something in common: the desire to address climate change, environmental pollution, and energy security through the promise of renewable energy. Going in alphabetical order. Mark Jacobson is the Director of Atmosphere Energy Program and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Stanford University. He is also a Senior Fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment and a Senior Fellow of the Precourt Institute for Energy. He is on the Energy Efficiency and Renewables Advisory Committee for the U.S. Secretary of Energy. And he was my advisor at Stanford. Marco Krapels is the Executive Vice President of Rabobank North America, where he runs the commercial banking product groups, including its capital markets and renewable energy finance divisions. He co-chairs the bank's Corporate Social Responsibility Committee, where he's initiated notable sustainability efforts, including a Rabobank solar Tesla electric car project featured in the New York Times. Marco is co-founder and board member of Empowered by Light, which promotes renewable energy solutions for 1.6 billion people living without electricity. And last, but certainly not least, Mark Ruffalo is an Oscar-nominated actor and renewable energy advocate. In March 2011, Mark co-founded Water Defense to raise awareness about the impact of energy extraction on water and public health. A regular contributor to The Guardian and the Huffington Post, Mark is a recent recipient of the Global Green Millennium Award for Environmental Leadership. Most recently, he played Dr. Banner in The Incredible Hulk in the Avengers. I will hold back on making any green puns. I wouldn't want to make him angry. Thanks for coming and welcome to Google. For those of you who'd like to ask questions, we have a Google moderator page set up at Go Wind Water Sun. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Thank you, Google, for having us here. I'm more nervous about this than I am any of that acting stuff I do. I want to start by how I got here. I really don't want to be here today. I'd rather be at home with my kids today, running in the sprinkler. It's the first day of summer. But 3 years ago, I made the, I guess, fortunate or unfortunate decision to move my family to upstate New York, where they can live with trees and flowers and chirping birds and clean water and fresh air. And shortly after moving there, I found out that this incredible thing called hydrofracking was going to happen in my community. And when I first heard about it, I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was going to give us energy independence. It was clean. It was cheap. All it was injecting a little sand and water into the ground, and it was going to free us from war, pestilence, viruses, the plague, and Satan himself. That sounded great to me. So I'm the type of person, I'm a very simple man, and decided that I would go online and check out what exactly hydrofracking was. And as I started looking into it, I started seeing there was a lot of problems with it, like people being able to light their wells on fire and coming down with brain lesions and their well caps blowing 50, 60 feet into the air and their water becoming contaminated and their children developing asthma and spills and their pets and livestock dying or going bald or becoming ill. And those things didn't sound like white bread to me. And I realized that maybe hydrofracking was more relatable to asbestos, the greatest thing since asbestos, than white bread. If you remember when we had our beginning love affair with asbestos, it was the greatest thing that could ever have happened to us. It was going to change our world. It was going to make jobs for us. And it was just this incredible thing. And in time, we've come to find out that it isn't so incredible. So I began basically, I went to Dimmock, PA with Robert Kennedy Jr., and I saw a group of people, probably 40 people, who had their wells contaminated with natural gas from hydrofracking. And there was no one there to help them. And they literally looked at Robert Kennedy Jr. as if he was Jesus Christ himself and walked across the water to save them. Unfortunately, at that time, Robert Kennedy Jr. had been toking off the natural gas pipe and was a big natural gas advocate. It's taken us 2 years to turn him around, but by God we have. Us and science and a lot of compelling anecdotal evidence that tell us that this is not the way to move forward. But while I was there, I had family after family come up to me, and since I was the B-list celebrity in the room behind Robert Kennedy Jr., I was the next savior, something on par to probably Houdini more than Jesus Christ. But I recognized an enormous need that they had that wasn't being filled neither by their legislative body in the state of Pennsylvania, nor by the EPA, which had been exempted. This industry had been exempted from any federal regulation. And they were asking for my help. And I decided that I would run as far away from them as I possibly could. But I couldn't run away from myself. And I realized that I wouldn't be the human being that I say I am if I turned my back on them. Essentially, I'd be turning my back on my own children and my own community just across the Delaware River. And so I began fighting hydrofracking in New York State. And at some point, that wasn't enough for me. I felt like you can't really be effective at fighting something unless you can come up with an alternative to that thing that was viable and that was credible. And so in my very, I like to model myself after Percival the Fool. I went like the fool into the world saying, I don't know what the hell I'm doing or what I'm talking about, but I like to go find some people that do know what they're doing and what they're talking about. And I was invited to go to the Global Green Awards, which I didn't want to get an award for this work. I went kicking and screaming. They wanted to honor me with an environmental award. I didn't feel like I deserved it, but I didn't want to be an asshole, so I went. And while I was there, shortly after, I gave my speech on natural gas to a very large group of people who at that time still believed that natural gas was the answer. And I was there to say no. Well, after it, this crazy Dutchman came up to me, and he said, "Hi, I'm Marcellus, and I'm here to help you fight Marcellus." Now, Marcellus Shale is where New York is, they want to extract the gas from, and Marco Krapels' real name is Marcellus. And he said, you know, we have to talk about the solution. So I kind of had said, well, I want to do this crazy thing. Why aren't we going to renewables? Why are we going to go to natural gas and then renewables? I mean, why don't we just go directly to renewables? Like, why do we have to, like, bridge to it? Why don't we, like, hang glide over it? And he said, come to California, and I'm gonna put together some meetings, and we're doing this here, and I think you can do it in New York. And he brought me to a dinner, and at that dinner was Professor Mark Jacobson and a lot of other really influential people in the renewable space. And what I started to hear was what I believed in my heart was that we actually could make this transition without introducing an entire new fossil fuel infrastructure to our nation that would cost us $700 billion to build out. And we actually could hang glide over natural gas and move directly to renewable energy. And we could do it in my lifetime. And that was the beginning of this journey. And along this journey, I only knew that the only thing that I could offer to these brilliant people was that I was a conduit of information to my culture, to the culture. And we're in an information war, really is what this is about. It's about education. Because the truth is that we can do this. We are technologically poised to do it. But there's an enormous political lobbying structure in place in this country that is telling us that we can't do it, and that we are bound to be a fossil fuel nation for another 50, 60, 100 years, and that just isn't the truth. And so I started to try and make myself knowledged in what the truth was by going to scientists, going to business leaders, going to bankers, and asking, is this possible and how do we do it? And that was basically how I came to be sitting here with these two extraordinary gentlemen. There's another gentleman here named John Wank from Skedaddle, who's also basically our media genius. And we figure that if you can handle the science and the culture and the banking and the economics and then have a platform to get the message out, we actually have a chance of making this thing happen. And so the idea of solutions was born. And none of us are on the payroll of anybody. We all flew ourselves here today. We are only compelled to move forward with this mission because we have children and we believe that it's the right and responsible thing for each of us to do. And that gives us an enormous amount of credibility in the face of who our opponent is and the enormous amount of political and economic power that they wield against us. And so at this moment, I would gladly like to shut up and turn over this podium to the great Professor Mark Jacobson from Stanford.
This really came to fruition in 2009 when Dr. Mark DeLucci of UC Davis and I published a paper in Scientific American on how to power the world with renewable energy. Or was it really, the question was at that time, was it technically feasible to do this? And did we have enough materials? Were there enough resources available? What were the costs like? Was it really possible to power the entire world? And by extension, of course, the United States and individual states. And it was by fortune that I met Mark Ruffalo and Marco Krapels and there are some others, John Wank and others in our group. It was very fortunate because, and it's actually been very exciting because kind of working as a scientist, you're often working on your own or in a small group, and nobody really wants to listen to the scientists who put out reports, and then there are people who put out things to try to discredit you or to try to minimize whatever you do. And so this is actually an opportunity, I think, to bring the information out. I mean, my job, I feel, is to study a subject and then bring that information out to the public and to students and to the world to clarify it. And so that's what I want to do here today. So really what I want to talk about in the next few minutes, and it might take a little more than a few minutes, but is how to power the world and the United States with renewable energy. Is it really feasible? So first of all, why do we want to do that? And I'm going to first try to step forward. There we go. Oops. I think we just went to the end. There we go. I think we're even one more back. There. Okay. Well, anyway, so what is the problem? Why do we need to do this, first of all? From my point of view, it's from an air pollution and climate point of view. There are 2.5 to 3 million people die every year from air pollution, from cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, complications from asthma, disease, pneumonia. In fact, about 15 to 20% of these are children under 5 years of old age in developing countries. And this number is growing. And global warming is a significant problem. Whether or not you believe it, it's true, it's happening. The temperature changes today are faster. The rate of change of temperature today is faster than any time since the deglaciation from the last ice age. And this is a significant issue because half of global warming is actually being hidden or masked by cooling, what are called cooling pollutant aerosol particles. The particles that you actually see in the air from pollution are hiding half of global warming. So if we actually clean up all the air pollution particles in the world, which we want to do, because these are the ones that cause the 2.5 to 3 million deaths, most of them, then we would actually double global warming instantaneously. And that's a scary problem. The Arctic sea ice is disappearing rapidly, as I'll show you. And this is also scary because within 20 years, if it disappears, then there'll be possibly a rapid tipping point where there'll be more rapid acceleration of warming. And populations are increasing quickly, and as a result, and there's rising energy demand, and our current fossil fuel infrastructure, the fuels themselves are short-lived. They're not going to be here, even if we use them all for next 100, 150 years. They're eventually going to disappear. We're subject to significant price fluctuations. If we go to clean renewable energy, there are no price fluctuations because the fuel is free. Now, let's look. I just want to show you an example. I mean, we look outside here in the Bay Area, and especially near the Bay, and it's extremely clean looking on most days. But you go in most places in the world, and it looks like this. And here's Norilsk, Russia, Sukinda, India. There's Linfen, China. It's like living here is like smoking 3 packs of cigarettes every day. This is the real problem in the world. And this pollution, it's not only creates health problems, but the darkness of the pollution means that it's absorbing sunlight and heating the air. And this is why these pollutant particles, the dark ones, are the second leading cause of global warming after carbon dioxide, the black carbon and brown carbon in these particles. And they also cause health impacts. And they're also very short-lived. So if you control them, they're actually a very fast method of slowing global warming. In fact, if they're the only method, by controlling those particles, it's probably the only method of saving the Arctic sea ice because of their short-lived, along with methane, which is number 3 in the terms of the leading causes of global warming. And by the way, methane, the main source of methane, well, one of the main sources is from natural gas mining. And this is a big issue because the short-lived impact of that methane over the 20-year time frame is 80 times more significant per unit mass than carbon dioxide, 80 to 100 times. Now, this is the lungs of a teenager who died in Los Angeles in the 1970s, and this is what the lungs of most teenagers in polluted cities of the world look like. So in the United States, there are 50 to 100,000 people die every year prematurely from air pollution. In California, it's about 20 to 23,000. And this is a problem that still needs to be solved. And that doesn't count all the illnesses and lost work days and school days, the higher taxes we pay, and the higher insurance costs that result. I talked about the sea ice. This shows from 1900 to 2010 or 2011, the Arctic sea ice in different seasons. The green, which is on the bottom, which is the most rapidly decreasing, is the summer. But you can see that the sea ice is decreasing in all seasons. But it's expected to entirely disappear within 20 to 30 years unless we do something. And as I mentioned, the temperature of the Earth is increasing rapidly. It's the rate of change of temperature that's so high today. And it just hasn't been this high. We've had higher temperatures on average. 100 million years ago, the Earth was ice-free. But nobody lived back then. So we didn't have 7 billion people on the Earth. If we melt all the ice that's stored in the Arctic, well, the Antarctic mostly, but the Arctic and all the glaciers, we would increase the sea levels by on the order of 65 to 70 meters, and we'd flood 7% of all the world's land along the coast, and that's where most people live. So this is an issue. So what's the solution? So the solution, we think, is based on a scientific analysis that was done in 2009 before the Scientific American article. was what we call wind, water, and sun. So what was recommended based on just ignoring the costs at first, we looked at a bunch of different technologies and found that the best ones in terms of their environmental benefits, in terms of health and climate, in terms of catastrophic risk, in terms of creating a reliable energy supply as well, simultaneously reducing water pollution, were wind and concentrated solar power, geothermal power, tidal power, wave power, solar photovoltaics, hydroelectric power. And that's for electric power. For transportation, it's using these electricity sources to power battery electric vehicles and, in some cases, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And the reason battery electrics are so good is they're 4 to 5 times more efficient than internal combustion. So in other words, for every gallon of gas you put into your tank, only about 17 to 20% of the energy in that gas goes to move your car. The rest is waste heat. Of every unit of electricity you plug into your car, about 80 to 86% actually goes to moving your car, and the rest is waste heat. As a result, electricity is so much more, it's 4 to 5 times more efficient than gasoline. So the best way to reduce your energy consumption is to use an electric vehicle by far, by converting from a combustion vehicle to an electric vehicle. In fact, as a result, the cost of the electricity to run your car is equivalent to about 80 cents to $1 a gallon, compared to $4 plus or whatever the price of gas is right now. Now, I'll get back to that later. But what's not recommended in our list, not because they're not in some cases better than what we have currently, in other cases it is not so good, are nuclear, coal with carbon capture, any kind of natural gas or biomass, corn or cellulosic or sugarcane ethanol, soy or algae biodiesel, or compressed natural gas. These are not recommended options. And again, I'm not trying to totally criticize them, although some of these you can really criticize a lot. But I'm just saying they're not as so good as what we call the wind, water, and sun options, and I'll show you why. So, for example, why not nuclear power? Everybody thinks, oh, it's clean power. Well, in fact, because of you need to mine the uranium and refine it continuously over the life of the power plant, and then use it, and then you have to store the waste. And that's half of the emissions are associated. There are 2 coal-fired power plants in the US whose sole purpose is to refine uranium for nuclear power plus weapons. But it's also the fact that it takes like 11 to 19 years to put up a nuclear reactor. And not only due to the construction time, but due to the permitting time and planning time, compared to like 2 to 5 years for a wind or solar farm generally. And so in the meantime, you're running the electric power, the current electric power grid, which is 55 to 60% coal. So there's an opportunity cost by going to, say, nuclear versus wind, due to this time lag between planning and operation. And that's huge. And so between the 2 of those additional emission sources, you have 9 to 25 times more carbon equivalent emissions and air pollution per kilowatt hour generated from nuclear than you do from wind power. But that's not even the major problem. There's the risk of meltdown. 1.5% of all nuclear reactors ever built, and there have been about 440, have melted down to some degree. And there's nuclear weapons proliferation. There are 5 countries that have secretly developed nuclear weapons capability under the guise of nuclear energy facilities that were supposed to be used for civilian purposes. And there are unresolved waste issues. Why not what's called clean coal? Well, what clean coal is you take the CO2 exhaust from the exhaust of the coal plant and you pump it underground. And that reduces about 85 to 90% of the CO2 from the exhaust. However, there's all the CO2 from the mining and the transport of the coal, which is about 1/3 of the emissions. And plus, you need 25% more coal because it requires 25% more energy to run the carbon capture equipment. So as a result, the CO2 carbon capture does not reduce any other pollutants aside from CO2. And so you actually increase all the other pollutants like SOx, SO2, ammonia, NOx, oxide of nitrogen, hydrocarbons, particulate matter by 25%, increasing the air pollution from coal. So it's nothing close to clean. And in fact, it's about 50 times more CO2 per unit energy than wind and 150 times more pollution per unit energy. Why not ethanol? Well, you still have to burn the ethanol like a combustion fuel, and so you produce a similar amount of air pollution. In fact, we found in the US about 4% higher mortality due to converting to ethanol compared with gasoline because you have a lot of aldehydes coming out of the tank instead of aromatics. But the aldehydes are more reactive at producing ozone, which causes significant health problems. So there's on the order of the same air pollution, but in terms of the CO2, which everybody has pushed ethanol for corn ethanol, it's only at best you can get 90% of the gasoline CO2 emissions, but you could get even higher, 200%. You can double these CO2 emissions if, due to land use change that results from price changes from corn. Cellulosic ethanol, it's a little bit better, but it's still 50 to 150%. So you really don't know if you're actually getting any carbon benefit. But compared to wind energy powering battery electric vehicles, it's 99% CO2 reductions and air pollution reductions, more than 99%. And I'll show you the land use required for the ethanol, then you'll really see why it's not so useful. Natural gas, in terms of air pollution and CO2, it's at least 50 to 70 times more CO2 per kilowatt hour than wind energy. And hydrofracking, as Mark mentioned, causes lots of water issues, groundwater contamination, and potential leakage of methane into the atmosphere, which is dangerous, especially for the Arctic sea ice. And so now I want to just focus then for a few minutes on, so what are these options that are wind, water, and sun options? You're all familiar with most of them. Wind turbines, these are wave devices. There are actually a lot of different types of wave devices, and it's still pretty much in its infancy, but there are several types of wave devices that have been tested and work. And they take advantage of the up and down motion of the wave. There's hydroelectric power, which could be from dams, which nobody likes too many dams. And we don't envision many more dams. 70% are already in place that we need. In fact, if we can minimize them, that's great, but we might have a few more. And there's also what's called run-of-the-river electricity, where you don't actually build a dam, you just extract the energy from flowing water. Tidal power, basically a wind turbine under the water in tides, in the presence of tides. Geothermal power, you're extracting heat from the rocks under the earth and converting that into electricity. Then there's concentrated solar on the top left, which you focus light from mirrors onto a central tower receiver to heat a fluid that then heats water, and from the steam from the water you can generate electricity through a steam generator. Or you can store the hot fluid overnight and generate electricity at night, which is a nice thing about concentrated solar. It's a nighttime source of electricity. In fact, a plant in Spain ran their concentrated solar plant for 24 hours last summer. And then there's also photovoltaics that can be either in power plants or on rooftops. And of course, at Google, you know all about that. And of course, there's the electric cars, which are all existing, and I don't have to say too much about them. But I do want to point out there are also hydrogen fuel cell buses. There are electric trucks that are existing. These are existing technologies. And hybrid, in fact, there's a hydrogen fuel cell electric hybrid bus. So these are all clean. Hydrogen is less efficient than electricity straight for vehicles, but it's still more efficient than gasoline. And it's much cleaner. I mean, it's still 99% clean in terms of carbon emissions and air pollution, but it's not quite so efficient as electricity. Now, in terms of boats, this is the wrong title, but in terms of ships, this is an existing hydrogen fuel cell ship. Tractors, this is a hydrogen fuel cell tractor. That's an electric ship. These are existing technologies for the most part. Of course, they can be improved. And on the right is a cryogenic hydrogen aircraft, which is run on liquefied hydrogen. The space shuttle ran on liquefied hydrogen, and the Russians built a Tupolev in the 1980s that ran on this. But it's more voluminous. You need more volume to store the hydrogen, but it weighs less because of the lightness of hydrogen. For heating and cooling, there's air source and ground source heat pumps, and also solar hot water preheaters. Okay, so let's jump then to some statistics. The end-use power demand today is about 12.5 terawatts. That's for all purposes. All of the world society uses 12.5 terawatts of end-use power to run devices, to drive cars, to heat and cool, for everything. Now, in 2030, with current fuels, we expect to go up to 17 terawatts. if we convert to wind, water, and sun, because of the efficiency of electricity and hydrogen to some extent, you go down by about 32%. So you reduce energy demand, power demand, worldwide by 32% by converting to wind, water, and sun. In the US, it's 37% because we're so heavily dependent on combustion for vehicles that you get even greater efficiency there. So we really need to shoot for 11.5 terawatts by 2030. So how do we do that? Well, one way is this plan. It's not, by no means it's the only way, but 50% wind, 40% solar, and 10% everything else. And why those proportions? Well, wind and solar are the only technology, or the only resources that you can power the entire world on their own by many times, and I'll show you that in a minute. But and wind is a little less expensive, or it's less expensive right now than solar, although the cost of solar, price of solar has gone down significantly, so it's becoming rapidly very competitive. But 50% wind, that's 4 million, almost 5 megawatt wind turbines. Now in World War II, the US produced 330,000 airplanes in 4 years. And to power the entire world with, or half the world with wind, you need only 4 million wind turbines. It's really nothing. And the space, the actual land required for that, physically on the ground, for the poles in the ground, a little spacing, a little concrete around it, is the size of Manhattan, which is 38 square kilometers. And but I'll show you a map of this in a little bit. For solar, it would be divided between concentrated solar, solar PV, and rooftop PV. So 20% concentrated solar, 14% PV power plants, and 6% rooftops. And that's assuming huge amounts of rooftop solar. If we can do more, that's great. Then hydroelectric, 4%, but 70% of this is already in place. And then 4% geothermal, 1% each tidal and wave. Now, the area to power, this is just for the US on-road vehicles. Now, if we did this with cellulosic ethanol, we'd require, on average, about 18% of the entire US, including Alaska. Now, there's a range here. It's between 5 and 35%. 5% is the ethanol industry estimate, and 35% is the scientific estimate. But so this isn't being fair, just cut it in half, and that's what this represents. There's less certainty in corn ethanol, but it's still on the order of 14% of the entire US to power the US vehicle fleet. Now, nuclear, that's not one of its main problems. It doesn't take up a huge amount of space unless you live in Rhode Island. It's about the size of Rhode Island you need to power the US vehicle fleet. So we can sacrifice Rhode Island for nuclear. But you would need about 16,850 megawatt nuclear power plants to power the world with nuclear. We have 440 today. So even if you had 5% of the world powered by nuclear, you'd double the number of plants today, and there'd be more countries that could develop weapons capabilities like they are right now. Now, with wind, the footprint on the ground is that red dot in the middle of that black space, and that's 1 to 3 square kilometers. You need 1 to 3 square kilometers of land to power the entire US vehicle fleet with wind, due to the footprint. Now, spacing, you need spacing between the turbines, and that's the black. That's about 0.5% of the United States. Still, it's 1/30th that of corn ethanol. To do the same thing, but with corn ethanol, you have pollution, and you have global warming. With wind, you have no pollution, no warming, hardly any space, doesn't take up water. And a lot of it could go offshore, like in the East Coast, for example, which is the greatest offshore wind resource in the world almost. Now, for solar, you need 1/3 the spacing area as wind, but it takes more footprint. But it's not very much space. And geothermal is even smaller spacing area than solar, but still more footprint than wind. So these are not large areas for the wind, geothermal, and solar. This is just to power the whole US vehicle fleet. Now, what about how much wind is there? This is a map that our group developed, which is from modeling, but we also looked at data analysis for the same, got a similar number. It shows you the wind resources of the world. The Great Plains is referred to as the Saudi Arabia of wind. And in the East Coast and the West Coast, we have a lot of wind, although West Coast wind is it's deep, the water is very deep, so it's harder to get to. Now, this wind, you can power the world, this 11.5 terawatts, we can power it 6 to 7 times over with wind over land in high wind locations. High wind locations are about 15% of the entire world has high wind locations. And you have enough to power 6 to 7 times of the world power. There's even more solar than wind. There are 340 terawatts, so we can power the world about 30 times over for that 11.5 terawatts that we need. Now, what about reliability? This is a study that we did looking at, can you match the power supply with the demand? People complain that the wind and the solar are intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. That's true, but the demand also is variable as well. And it's not a question of just looking at wind or solar, it's looking at, can you match the power demand with the supply? And by combining wind and solar, geothermal and hydroelectric, you can actually match power demand in California 99.8% of the hours of the year. And this is a study we did for 2005 and 6 looking at with the constant geothermal load, which is the red on the bottom, increasing the amount of wind and solar, but keeping the hydro the same. The wind is the light blue. This is 2 particular days, every hour of 2 particular days. The yellow, the light yellow is solar PV, the orange is concentrated solar, the dark blue is hydroelectric without increasing the amount of hydroelectric in the state, they're using the existing amount. So we were able, the black line is the power demand for those 2 days, and we're able to match the power demand with supply over 2 years, every day for 2 years, except for 0.2% of the hours over 2 years. So we think it is possible to do this. It's just at each location you have to optimize your resources. And what about materials? Take neodymium, which is needed in permanent magnets and wind turbine generators. We need about 4 teragrams of neodymium for 3.8 million turbines, but there are about 27, 28 teragrams available. And so we have about 7 times more than we need. So we don't think this is a limitation. What about lithium? Well, lithium, there's enough lithium we know of in resources for 3.3 billion vehicles, and there are about 800 million vehicles right now. So again, and not all the resources have been uncovered. What about costs? The costs of conventional fuels are about 7 cents a kilowatt hour today, and they're going to go up to about 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour by 2020 to 30. This is forecasted from EIA, the Energy Information Administration. But there are also externality costs, which are a minimum of about 5 cents a kilowatt hour today. These are health and environmental costs, and going up to at least 6 cents a kilowatt hour in 2020 to 30. So we're talking about the real cost of conventional energy today is about over 12 cents a kilowatt hour and 13 to 15 cents in 2020 to 30. And these are conservative estimates for the externality costs, very conservative. Now wind, geothermal, onshore wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric are completely cost competitive today. In fact, in the US, wind has been the 2nd largest new source of electric power on average for the last 5 years. In Europe, wind and solar last year generated 68% of all the new electricity. So they're very cost competitive, both of them, even solar, even though solar has been getting a lot more, getting some subsidies. Now, the other costs are coming down for the rest of the technologies, and we expect by 2020 to 2030, they'll all be cost competitive, especially when you account for the externality costs of the fossil fuels. So just to summarize, we think that converting to wind, water, and sun will reduce world power demand by about 32%, in the US about 37%. So eliminate 2.5 to 3 million annual air pollution deaths, including 50 to 100,000 in the US every year. Eliminate global warming, provide energy stability. The cost of electricity will be similar to what we have, 4 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour for most technologies, 8 to 13 for some, and be similar to or less than conventional fuels. And additional long distance transmission to get, for example, from the Great Plains to 2,000 kilometers is about 1 cent a kilowatt hour on average, although there's a big range between 0.2 and 3 cents a kilowatt hour for long distance transmission. And finally, the total area required would be about 0.4% of the world's land for the footprint and 0.6% for the spacing. So 1% of the world for energy to power the whole world for all purposes forever. Well, we'd have to increase it a little bit over time. Compared to 40% of the world's land is used right now for grazing, farmland, and agriculture. There are many methods of addressing variability, and I only discussed one, but there are others as well. Materials are not limits, but recycling may be needed. There are barriers such as upfront costs, transmission need, lobbying, and politics. And with that, I want to turn it over to Marco, who's going to talk about the business and more financial aspects of what we need to do to get to clean energy.
So it's definitely downhill from here. After you're listening to the Hulk and the most renowned professor on this topic, you have to listen for 5 more minutes to an evil banker. But we're doing good things too, because we're financing a lot of renewable energy. So, you know, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about you know, how you turn all this science really into relevancy for businesses. So what can they do now? Before I do that, I wanted to you know, share with you some numbers, and which is what bankers do, and some quotes, things that I think are relevant to the discussion that I'm about to have. Businesses need price stability. I mean, you know, we have, I work for the largest agricultural bank in the world, and we bank farmers, lots of them, in 34 countries. And farmers are worried enough about commodity prices, and they understand that part. But in terms of energy, which is a huge component of their cost structure, they're really worried about it. It's volatile. Gas is up, gas is down. Oil is up, oil's down. And it's a concern. And rising energy costs, volatile energy costs, is something that has really worried a lot of our clients. And if you're a dairy farmer in Hanford, Central Valley, California, anyone from Hanford? No, didn't think so. You know, you are using a lot of water. Dairies use an enormous amount of water. They use an enormous amount of energy. As a matter of fact, the movement of water is one of the single largest sources of our electric use in this state. So that's an issue. It's an issue for businesses. It's an issue for farmers. So price stability is extremely important, and oil and gas, we've known for the last 50 years, have not provided that. Let me word it, yeah. There is a lot of sun. An hour of sun can power the planet for an entire year. You've seen those quotes. Mark and I had the fortunate opportunity to have a chat with Elon not too long ago, and you know, he made a perfect quote there. He said, listen, yeah, everything else already exists because of the sun. What are we waiting for? So I love, of course, the Google definition. You Google fossils, and of course what pops up is, you know, an antiquated or stubbornly unchanging person or thing. Well, there you have it. Thank you, Google, by the way. Because the truth rises to the top, right? Over the last 100 years, trillions of dollars have been invested in sustaining, you know, a fossil fuel infrastructure, which 50 years ago was a great idea because we didn't have any other choices. Today, we probably should slow that down a little bit. Eventually we will run out. What we're talking about is an inevitability, probably in our lifetime, most likely our children's. So in the history of mankind, we have like a second left. And of course, you know, I had the opportunity actually to be in the White House last week, and we discussed this topic, and we, you know, sort of reminded everyone that, and this is in congressional research, that, you know, in the last 50 years, about $400 billion in subsidies and tax breaks have been going to oil and gas, and still about $4 billion a year. That's a lot of money if you compare that to the minuscule portion that's been invested in actually developing a renewable energy infrastructure. This is very important to our clients. It's, you know, what our clients have faced in the last 30, 40 years. It's rising and volatile energy costs. Not good if you're trying to build a sustainable business model. So, tell you a little client story here. I have 2 more stories, and then you know, we'll close it. I think we're doing okay on time now. But a lot of our clients are agricultural. They tend to be right-leaning. And a lot of them are in California. They're mostly located in the valley, all the way from Oregon to the Mexican border. We have about 3,000 of those clients. And so 2 years ago, when I decided we need to put a team on the ground, not just to invest in utility-scale solar projects and multi-billion-dollar syndicated bank deals, but also wanted to make renewable energy solutions relevant to our own client base. The people that have been telling me, I'm worried about energy costs. So I started visiting, after I hired some people, we started visiting the clients and sit down, and this is Lakeside Dairy It's a dairy farm in Hanford, California. You'll see the size of the solar plant. It's a 1 megawatt solar plant right next to the farm, which was, by the way, on fallow land. There's nothing else you could have done with that land. And I sat down with them, and I started to talk renewable energy. And they looked at me as if I literally just landed from a spaceship. And they said, Marco, and his name is Manny and Mike Montero, two brothers, dairy farmers. And they said, Marco, no. We know you live in San Francisco, and we know that you're all green and tree huggerish, but the green that we like is this kind of green. This is the green that we like. And I said, fine, you can have both. You can have both. And I showed them the chart, and I made them show me their energy bills. We spent an entire afternoon, and they agreed. They said, yeah, it's really frustrating the hell out of us. We need to take control of this energy cost. And I said, well, we bank a few big solar companies, and why don't you talk to them? Because I think this can do something for you. Well, this is what happened. They ended up investing, so it creates jobs, spend capital, jobs that needed desperately to be created because there's a lot of unemployment in the Central Valley. And they invested in a $4 million power plant, solar power plant. They did a very simple math calculation, which every one of our clients is doing right now. If you look at the acquisition cost of solar, you deduct the local incentives, tax rebates, and whether that's an investment tax credit or what used to be the cash grant. And that is a net cost for solar. And you divide that by the expected amount of kilowatt hour output for the next 30 years, because these things last. And that resulting number is your per kilowatt hour cost. And if that number compares favorably with the number that you were paying last month, then it's an economically sensible decision. And a lot of our clients are making these calculations, and this is actually well above our expectations, is a constituency that you would expect a natural resistance from is adopting this as a very, very, very fast rate. We have many other clients that have done the math, looked at it, and said, yeah, this gives us, some energy independence, and not energy independence being beholden by 5 big oil and gas companies or utility telling you your rates are going up. No, you're controlling your own power. It happens to be green, and they do care about that. They have children. They don't want they don't want their kids to have to suffer, so they do care. It helps them, most importantly, is fix their energy cost. And this is what this has done for our client. The other one is a really interesting example too, is Castle Rock Vineyards. Owner is Al Good. Al's a great guy. He called us up and said, listen, let's talk. I heard from these other farmers that you've been doing this for what you've done, because farmers talk. When you have a happy farmer, everyone will know. When you have an angry farmer, they'll know sooner. So we got to talk to Al. Al did the same thing. He's a table grape grower and is storing all of his table grapes in a very, very large cooling facility powered by a 1 megawatt solar plant today. Now, when we did the numbers for him, it turned out that the per kilowatt cost of solar actually wasn't as attractive compared to his traditional utility bill as the other client example I gave you. Because this guy is on an ag meter, and if you're on an ag meter, you pay probably a little bit less than if you're on a regular commercial meter. But he still did it. And you know why? He's selling table grapes to very, very large retailers. Retailers in the UK, retailers in the United States. And to respect the confidentiality, I cannot disclose the names of those retailers. But what are those retailers doing? They are ranking the sustainability of their supply chain. And according to the sustainability of their supply chain, they're starting to rank and create a sort of preferred provider list. And so he did this because his clients wanted him to do it. And he's selling more grapes today because of the decision that he made, which was, by the way, a cost-neutral decision. So those, I think, are two examples of how the science can be turned into an actual product with a financing product around it, which has been very, very beneficial. Now, in closing, what do we need? We need to make sure that the tremendous amount of subsidies that are still going into a fossil fuel-based industry start to be rerouted to sustain what is still very much a developing industry. You can't just say there is a tax credit 1 year for solar and we take it away the next year, because you can't build a business on that. You need sustainable policy to continue to grow this sector, which, by the way, deserves equally as much, if not more, support from our political leaders as these other industries have. And that's something we feel very strongly about, something that I'll continue to help advocate, and that's about all I have to say. So thank you very much.
So we're going to invite the speakers back up and take questions. We have a Google moderator page at Go Wind Water Sun. Excuse me.
May I sit here?
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you. Really interesting talk, and congratulations on doing really important and amazing work for all of us.
Thank you.
So thank you. Little disclaimer, I guess I worked in the solar field for a while before I started at Google. So I guess my question is, what work and collaboration is happening on the finance side in terms of educating banks and investment partners and tax equity providers to expect a rate of return that is maybe not in line with other investments? Because from personal experience, I found that was something that would hold up a lot of projects. And I think it's a balance, because obviously everybody's in there to make money and it's a business, and that's ultimately a good thing. But to say, here's our standard on an oil and gas investment where, maybe we're making 20% IRR, that's not really reasonable on a solar facility or on a CSP.
That question is for you, Mark. No, I'm joking.
I got this one. It's my strong suit.
Tax equity all the way.
Yeah.
I think it's a good question. I think that, there are a few big players in the tax equity investment world. There were very few a few years ago, because in order to be able to use tax equity, you need taxable income. And the banks were losing a lot of money a couple of years ago. And so there wasn't that much available. It's starting to come back. I think the few big players that are out there, you know who they are, they continue to attract good, solid investments. I think that the emergence of impact funds, I think, could help, where people could allocate a certain amount of their mutual funds into impact funds. Those funds may be investing something that may have a benefit for society, and may still have a healthy 10-15% return, but may not be the 20% return, but at least you can go to sleep and feel good about what you've done. So I think there's a place for that. And I do, but again, back to, let's use your tax equity example. If the 1603 cash grant were reinstated, we wouldn't be worried about tax equity, right? And so I think this is really, really important, is that, we need to do what we can to let our leaders know that, guys, you can't just give it and then take it away. So I do hope at some point that comes back. Probably have to wait till after November. Yeah. I don't know. Look at yourself. Would you accept a lower yield for something that you feel is the right thing to do? And so I think there's if you look at portfolio allocation, there's a place for that. I think there is. And it's easier for private institutions like ourselves to do that than publicly listed institutions. Although there are a few publicly listed institutions that are under quite a bit of pressure right now to do something right. Yeah. So this is definitely the right time to have that dialogue.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For Mark Jacobson, you made several references to the land use of the windmills themselves versus the space between them. Are there particular things that's done with, like, the surrounding land, like pasture grazing, or?
Yeah, so wind turbines, if they're on agricultural land, they can be used the land can be used for dual purposes, such as either grazing or farmland. I mean, in fact, in the Great Plains, there are many farmers, I mean, it could be hundreds at this point, that take leases, put wind turbines on their land and get paid royalties for that. So there are multiple. And even on Altamont Pass, I mean, you can see the green. We've preserved the green foothills. You can see the wind turbines there, but the grass is green, and it's grazing on that land as well. And over the ocean, I mean, there's no land over the ocean when you put it offshore. So there's no land use taken up at all.
Okay. Also, you made a reference to what was it, like a seventh of the all the wind in the world over land, providing what, about 7 times the
right. So if you take all the locations where the wind speed at 100 meters height is 7 meters per second or faster, which is the speed you need for cost-competitive wind energy. If you limit the land to the land area for those speeds, there's around 7 times more wind available over land outside Antarctica than we need for all purposes. And that wind would comprises that whole wind, that 7 times the whole wind is about 15% of all world land has that speed.
Yeah, I was wondering if you do like wind turbines at a larger scale, is there like a nonlinearity where one wind turbine kind of like slows down the wind that the next one receives? And so
Yes,
as you scale them up, you get diminishing returns.
Yeah, in fact, we've studied that in detail. In fact, we just finished a global study that we just put wind turbines over the entire world,
Right.
every single, over land, over water, just see what's the saturation wind potential of the world. And it was about 270 terawatts, which is compared to 11.5 terawatts that we need. But over land, it was about 70. It was close to that 75 terawatts or so. So that's totally putting wind turbines over all the land in the world. You get 75 terawatts, and we don't even need nearly that much.
Right.
We only need half of 11.5, 5.75 terawatts.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, one of the key selling points that you mentioned for these renewable sources was basically the economic stability, as opposed to the price fluctuations in oil and coal and other fossil fuels. But I'm wondering, it seems like that stability once everything's been built out. So what do you see kind of the economic situation of that build out? Because it looks like for several of these sources, we're going to have to ramp up production by several orders of magnitude. And we're not going to be the only ones who are trying to get at these resources. I know a lot of them are overseas. So what's the risk kind of for disruption in prices or fluctuations in prices during this ramp up and build out phase?
Can I give one answer from a business perspective? And then you should probably talk about the larger scale. Is that okay? Yeah. So just look at solar. Demand for solar is increased substantially over the last few years. And the price of solar per watt is dropped through the floor. So the increased demand to ramp up is not necessarily a negative for price, as long as, the supply-demand balances, right? And so I think, as an example, solar, from a business owner perspective, who was seeking to acquire this as a way to mitigate energy volatility, it's this increasing demand for solar has caused a significant increase in supply, which has actually driven the price down. So, but that's just on a solar on a smaller scale, and on a sort of distributed basis, has done fairly well in meeting that ramped up demand.
I'd say with the right policies in place, then it doesn't have to be an issue. Like in the U.S. right now, the issue is that the wind energy production tax credit, like it's expiring at the end of this year. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the wind markets as a result. And so if there were policies in place that could make these more stable, I mean, even the solar credit was a longer credit, that it's not an issue, because especially if there's also a mandate to go to large scale, then we can plan things. It's critical to plan these things ahead of time. If we just do it kind of randomly, have a wind farm here, a solar farm here, without any kind of real planning of this, then you can run into supply and demand issues. But if it's really planned and everybody's on board and wants to do this, then I think it's a lot easier, and the policies can be put in place and it can be all facilitated.
Right. I think just kind of, for example, one of the weak points that I saw, one of the things I was wondering about was batteries. You mentioned that there's that we currently have 800 million cars in the world, and based on current battery technology, there's something like 3.3 billion cars worth of metals out there. But what happens when, you mentioned recycling, but what kind of recycling program would we really need to have in order to be able to, really use all of that? And what kind of mining operations would we need to have in order to get at a sufficient chunk?
Well, a lot of the lithium is in Bolivian salt flats. And so there are these huge, well, I showed a picture of them. You could see it just goes on forever, these salt flats, and they're only like a meter under the ground. You don't have to go, they're under the salt. They're just 1 meter down. Like anything, well, the prices control the recycling rates. I mean, so as you get shortages, the prices go up, and then people start recycling to take advantage of that, and then hopefully the prices stabilize. So it can be a market-driven thing in terms of the, how much recycling is done. But there are a lot more resources, I'm sure, out there as well. These are just the known resources, and people only started recently look. I mean, just in the last 2 years, the USGS doubled their estimate of the reserves because they started looking, and because they weren't interested in it before. And so now so I think they're actually a lot more than what I showed there.
You guys have a great story, and American companies like this one are buying into using wind and water to power our data centers, for example. I'm wondering, what success have you had in other countries that matter a lot, like India and China, in getting them to adopt these technologies?
Well, my experience, certainly Germany is very far ahead in terms of putting policies in place like the feed-in tariff, and really pushing forward solar and wind. They've decommissioned most of their nuclear. Japan just decommissioned 50 nuclear power plants. China is pushing forward with lots of wind and solar, but they're also pushing forward lots of coal and so they're kind of just pushing everything forward. So I think we have to set an example here. I mean, we can't really control so much what other countries are doing, although there are a lot of people in other countries who are trying to make a big difference too. But I think if we set a good example here, which we're capable of, I think they'll follow pretty quickly.
Hi guys. I know the focus of the presentation was on delivering enough energy to meet our current needs. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where the middle ground is between actually making technologies more efficient, changing the way cities are planned, and people's habits on being more efficient.
Yeah, I can say something on that. So yeah, I talked about one kind of efficiency, which is like converting to electricity, but there's the other kind is energy efficiency in buildings, better city planning. It's definitely part of this as well. I just didn't mention it, and I should have. But conservation, of course. But we tried to be conservative in the study to assume that people weren't going to be conserving, that they wanted to use their current amount of energy, and just to be conservative about it, because we don't want our plan to rely on people conserving, and it turns out they don't. And also city planning. But if people do, and if things become more efficient, technologies are more efficient, and cities are planned better, that would make it even easier. We'd even hopefully need less energy than the 11.5 terawatts. So that's definitely an important component, and I don't want to underestimate the benefit of it. So,
If I may provide a partial response to this as well, I think we need a wave of massive energy awareness on an individual level. 30 years ago, people were told that smoking was fine. Doctors were used in Marlboro and Camel advertisements saying, "I smoke and so should you." And so I bet you that most Californians don't know that unless this is from your own renewable source, that 41% of that light power is coming from gas-powered power plants who are getting an increasing portion of that gas from the fracking that's happening next to Mark's farm. And I think you need an awareness, and then you need the solutions. So I think when people realize that smoking is not bad for them, is not good for them, they'll put the cigarettes down and they'll do something else. I think we need some awareness on an individual level, and engage a much broader audience than I think the selective group of people who are taking a real interest in this.
So with that, we're going to bring it to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be posting this on YouTube soon. Thank you.
Thank you.